Now, what I'm going to do is walk you through my most recent track that I've finished. It's a track called Layers, and I'm going to show you how I came up with this. Yeah, it's a pretty awesome track. Looking forward to showing you guys. Yo, what's up everyone? This is Dynamix. Welcome to my channel. If you are returning, thanks so much for showing up to see this new video. And if you're new here today, thanks for coming along. I hope you enjoy what I've got in store for today. Now, before we get into the main content here, just a quick thing. I've got a website which I'm going to put down in the description. If you're into what I'm showing you here, please go onto my website and sign up for my email list. There's two things I'm working on. The first one is a sample pack, or a preset pack I should say, for Vital Synth. So I'm working on that at the moment. So if you're interested in that, you'll be the first to know about it. The other one is that I am going to be offering some one-to-one tuition in the near future. So if that's something that you're interested in, please go in and subscribe to my email list there. And I'll be sure to update you with anything that is worth your time to consider. I'm not going to spam you guys. Just if you're into it, just get down in there. So check the description for that. Right, so today we're going to get into my track Layers. I'm going to break down my process, how I went about creating this track, everything from the drums to the bass, right down to the pads and effects, and essentially how I structured the whole track out. So let's get into it. Right, so the first thing is I started with the break, and just so you get an idea of what happened in this session, I actually sat down to just create a drum kit and a break that I could use in a future track, because sometimes I just spend time focusing on one thing meticulously. However, when I started doing this, the track just asked to be written, and it just happened. It was one of those ones. So this is the break that I started off with. So really nice break. Now, what I did is I threw it into Studio One, chopped it all up, and selected the hits that I liked. And what I ended up with was loading it up into Impact XT inside of Studio One, which is just your straight sort of, drum machine with pads. And this is a way I really like to work sometimes. So what I'll do is I'll solo this and just let you guys hear what I've got. So I ended up with a break that sounded really, really good. Now, when you hear the kick, you'll notice it's really tinny, and I'm just going to select these two here and I'm going to mute them, and you can hear it without. So very quickly you can tell that there's a difference, and what I've actually done is I've layered in a separate kick and snare. And I've taken this one from one of my other tracks. I really like this kick. It just had the right body, and I knew that it would sound good with this break. So that's layered in and tuned with it. And then I've got this snare, which just helps to add like a bit more transient to it. So if I mute that out and then add it back in, and it just gave me the tone that I was looking for. Additionally, I added in some other sounds to the kit. So I added in this little milkshake shaker, tambourines, perks, some additional hats, and then I've got some other little perks as well, effects and additional snares. And all of these are there to create accenting and keep the drums very interesting. So this track is centered around the breaks. So the other thing that I've done is I've added in a hi-hat layer, which is just this hi-hat loop. And that just adds a little bit more interest to the drum. So if I let you all hear what the kit sounds like without it. And this is with it added. Just a bit of that subtle fairy dust that makes things sound a whole lot better. All right. Moving along, the other thing which I added into the drums here was some tambourines. So tambourines and shakers are a really, really good way to add energy to your drums without detracting too much away from what the core break is. If you're wanting to keep your track sort of consistent to the drums that you've built and not be cut changing between different breaks, this is the sort of way to help carry your tracks forward. It allows you to add energy in a subtle way that just helps to carry things and make the track feel like it's moving forward. So we've got two different tambourines in here. So I'll just play you the break. This one here will be the first one you hear play through, and this one will be the second. Sorry. So let me isolate this. So it gives a nice switch up between those two tambourines in the different sections of the track. Finally, I've got a reverse which is made out of a splash. And when I was listening to this track, I was thinking about what kind of cymbal I'd want to use as a sweep reverse, and I was like, yeah, no, I want to use a splash for this. So if I just isolate this, you can hear it. And very quickly you can tell there's some delay and some panning on that. And I deliberately timed the delay and the panning to create more stereo effect, but it also sits in between the hits on the drums, so it creates a really great effect, especially when you've got cuts and pauses into different sections of the drums. So I'll just let you hear the drums in this part. So that's that there. And I'd also just highlight to you as well, in some of them I've stretched it and used it on the front of the beat, but I've actually stretched it in and made it shorter. And that's again just to create little sweeping effects. Subtle, you might not pick up on it unless you're actually listening to it. So the next thing I want to show you here is what I did with the processing inside of the mix. So the first thing I do when I'm working on drums and when I start mixing them is I focus on the kick first. So the first thing, I'm just going to take the effects off on here and I'm just going to solo the kick drum. And the first thing I added here was the UAD Little Labs VOG, which is short for the Voice of God. Basically, this plugin adds some really nice depth and oomph to the kick. So that's layered in there. And then the next thing is I add in ULA, can't talk, tongue-tied, Universal Audio's 1176 compressor. And the reason for this is because the Voice of God adds all this meat and thickness that I want, but it also bodies it up. So by adding the compression in, and what that's doing is it's just helping to emphasize the transient side of the kick drum so that I get the kind of shape that I'm looking for within it. I didn't want this kick drum to be full of attack. I wanted it to be kind of pillowy and fit within the feel of the break. So it does have a transient to it, but it's not really pokey. It's just more there as a presence type thing. So we've got that in there. And then finally, we've got the Smart EQ, which is just doing a final bit of EQing on that kick drum. And then I've played with the parameters and done some adjustments to that as well. So if I isolate the kick on its own here hear it without the effects running through, and then I'll switch it on, you can hear the difference. So a very different sound coming through after I've run those effects through it. Next thing is I've got the main snare, and I should point out actually that in the drum kit, all of the individual hits are being routed into these different channel strips. And so that's the breakdown of all the kits and their strips, and then that goes into the final sort of bus of the Impact XT. So on the snare drum, the first thing here, we'll just isolate this so you can hear this on its own. And straight away, the first thing I reached for was the Smart EQ, sorry, not Smart EQ, Smart Compressor, just to add a bit of compression to the drums. And then it's just running through an EQ, which is adding in a bump around the fundamental. So obviously at the time when I was doing this, I'm mixing with my ears and I'm playing everything in context, but I just want you to be able to see the sort of process that I'm doing underneath the break, rather than just going, here's a break I chopped and look how it sounds now. I'll just give you a bit of an idea of the workflow. So I'll let you hear the snare on its own, raw, and then with the processing. So you can see there it's obviously making a big difference. Next thing is we've got the hats. So main thing, I'm going to kind of broadly sweep across the other things like the hats, the perks, because I used a very similar process and pretty much exactly the same process. So first thing on there is we've got the Pro Q just doing a high cut, and then it's going through the Smart EQ again, doing some tonal shaping, and then it's going through the SSL X saturator, which is simply a saturation tool. I use saturation more than I would use something like compression or some other type of thing. So saturation, sometimes distortion, is the best way to get clarity in the mix before you even think about using a compressor or a limiter or anything like that. Okay, so I'll just let you hear the hats without the effects. And then the hats with the effects. Now these adjustments are very, very subtle, so they're not meant to be really drastic and like, oh my god, I can hear this massive change. When I'm playing the track, I'm listening to what helps that hat just cut through where it feels like maybe it's a little bit lost, but I'm not pushing it up so high that it's poking out and I'm like, oh yeah, I can definitely hear the hat. So some moves are obvious and some moves are subtle. On the Ghost snare, what we've got there is we've just got a compressor. So that's just helping to break the limit. And the reason I reached for that was because the Ghost snares were sort of like poking out a little bit, and I just wanted to grab the transient and lift out a bit more body in the Ghost hit. So there's a compressor on there and then a high cut. So nothing wild. I'm not doing any big drastic EQ moves. As I was saying before, same process as the hi-hat one on the perks. We've got these running through the exact same signal chain, obviously with different EQ, but again going through the X saturator. And then finally, we've got the other two processes, which is my perk effects, right? And the perk effects you're only going to hear on this part. Okay. Now, first thing you'll see there is it pops up with Black Hole. Black Hole is by Ventide. It's a really wild and awesome reverb. I love it. I use it pretty much in every track, and you can do some very, very cool things with this. And then finally it goes through Soothe 2. And what I've got here is a high pass and a low pass filter, and the reason that's there is just to isolate the fundamental frequencies which were poking up a little bit, so they're just pulling down slightly. So if you look at the Soothe 2, you'll see, and that's giving me about 3 to 4 dB of gain reduction. And then finally, I've just got hi-hat 2, which was on the kit, these ones here. Sorry, I haven't got these on solo. So these ones here, they're all running through into the hi-hat 2. Okay, and so they're there, but they've not got any effects other than a high pass on them because they already sounded really good as they were. I didn't need to do any processing. Finally, on the drum break, we've got a clip. So I'm using the standard clip by SIR Audio Tools. It's a really, really good clipper. And if I just come back to this break here, and I'll just turn off the Smart EQ for a sec, and we'll have a look at the meter on this. So you can see I'm chopping off the top here a bit, and I'm using a hard clip, and I've just got the clip set to 0. I've got the ceiling on. Now, if you listen to the break on its own, and I'm going to bypass it, and let me know if you think you can hear a difference. If you can, drop it down in the comments. So that's with it on, and that's bypassed. No audible difference, and that's giving us a dB of gain reduction and stopping those transient peaks popping out the top. So what that means for you when you're mixing your track is you've got more headroom. Okay, so if you haven't got this clipper, definitely go check it out, but you'll want to consider having a clipper for your arsenal when you're mixing drum and bass breaks. After it goes through the clipper, it's going through the Smart EQ, and you can see here it's just got some very subtle shaping, okay? This green knob here, which allows you to change how drastic all those moves are, you can see I've only allowed it to do a very subtle amount and what sounded right to my ear, so I wasn't letting it go out the gate like it wanted to in the beginning. So that's the drum break broken down in terms of the mix effects. And then on the hi-hat loop, we've got the same SSL X saturator again, just applying some drive saturation to it to help it cut through the mix, and exactly the same process with the tambourines as well. On the cluster delay, as I mentioned, we've got a delay there, and that delay is panning. So you'll see it pans right and left, right and left, right and left. And the whole reason for that is to create that sense of space, and it works really well with the break, especially in these pauses. So if I bring back this break, you can hear how it sweeps left and right, and it works nicely and fits in between the hits. So that's just there, subtle, but yeah, does add that little secret sauce that you might want within your track. So think about these kinds of things when you're building your drums. Okay, moving on. The next thing we want to look at is the bass. Now, as I said before, I originally started with the break, and I was just building out the drums, and I was, just having fun with it. And I had this loop going on. So often when I'm working with drums and building drums, I'll throw something in there to help guide my drums. It's always good to have something to work with that just gives you a sense of the genre you're working in. And I had this sort of sample sitting there waiting for use, and I grabbed it, and lo and behold, it just really worked. And before I knew it, I was massively inspired and I couldn't stop writing. So I'll just show you the original sample here. Cool. And this is the original sample with the drums. So it was at this point that inspiration fully kicked in and I could start to hear where I needed to go with this. So you go, great, I've got this great bass sample, but when you're working with a sample, and especially one like this sample doesn't want to be played at different pitches. It just wants to run the way that it does, in my personal opinion. If I started pitching this around, it'd start sounding weird. So you go, right, cool, I've got a great thing, but how do I get more out of it? I've only got this one thing stuck in this initial state. So one thing you might do if you're a creator, and let me know how you work, but you might go, cool, I've got this one sound, so now I'm going to go find another sound to be like a call and response. And that's fine. But I really wanted to make use out of the sound. And I'm always looking at my tracks and thinking, like, how can I get the most out of the core elements that originally had me inspired? And this is what I'm doing here. So we've got this original bass sound, and what I did as the first process was I bounced it out of my Apollo Twin by UAD and routed it through some guitar pedals that I've got. And with that, what I ended up with was running it through as basically a distortion and a sort of like reverb delay. And I bounced it out. I had some parameters that I was just working and moving those around, and I just took a whole bunch of audio and then I auditioned it and picked the bits that I liked. So I'll show you what these little bits are. Sorry. So all of those are like really nice mid sounds. And so what happens is when the track's playing and you've got the drums, I've now got these little variances that occur every second part on the first section of the track. So I'll let you listen back just to the drums and the bass with this part added. So you hear how it adds a really, really nice texture and really nice sort of mid sound. And then the other one which I did, which was I grabbed the sound and then I made this other pattern and I treated this one differently as well. So if you listen to this in isolation, and you'll notice that it's got some reverb and stuff on it, and I've shaped the sound a little bit differently. And what it's doing is it's working in opposition to the original motif, but what I wanted it to do was kind of sit back in the mix a little bit, because I'm always thinking about depth. I don't want everything to be up front. For me, that can get a bit jarring. I like to sense that my track has some level of three-dimensionality, so you can hear what's up front and what's back, and that creates a sense of depth. So you can hear these two opposed to one another. Different levels, a bit of reverb, and slightly sit back. Okay. And then we move on to some additional sounds in here. So I've got this sort of sweeping, it's a bit like an 808 sound. Right, and you can hear there's a bit of a reverb on it built into it. Okay, and I've chopped that up, and when you look at the bass line, you'll notice that we've got the original motif, this bass line here, and then we've got our layer over the top. Then these ones are sitting separately, so each part has its space. Okay, and what I did with this was it worked in such a way, if you listen, that it sort of swept down into the main bass motif. So that's with it on, and without, just hits it. So it gives me this nice little sweep into it, which is a really cool vibe. The other thing which I added in, which is I just grabbed this other sound that I had which is this here, and it's actually a really long bass note, but the start of it, the attack, the onset of the sound had a really cool sound to it, and so I just used that as well to sort of fill a gap and keep some interest, and that's this. So again, each part has its own little space to fill, nothing's conflicting with one another, and we end up with all of these parts working together. Cool. So think about placement rather than adding more or writing more. So when you're taking your original thing that inspires you, squeeze what you can out of it, add some complementary call and response elements, and then just see what you can get out of it. So you'll see here I've got some reverses like this one. This is reversing that sweep. And over here I've taken the original sound and added a reverse in as well. So little things like that just can keep things really interesting. Finally, I've got this mid sound with a really nice delay on it, and this just helps to add some more interest to the main track, the core parts. And it's got a really nice tail on it. So you'll notice when I take this sound, where this one hits on the end, this actually replaces it on this part. Okay, so that's the bass line sort of, or the bass section kind of broken down in terms of the musical elements. And then when we look at the mix, so if we go back and we start here at the core sound we started with, is just some processing. And the processing is really simple. And generally, if you're selecting good sounds, you shouldn't have to do much. Really, the things that you are doing is to help it fit in with the context of the track and the other elements that are working in there. So the first thing in the process that I've used is the Revival plugin, which is part of the Steven Slate channel strip selection. And this has this really nice thickening knob, and it also has shimmer as well. Now, given the sound doesn't have a whole lot of high frequency information, you're not going to hear drastically what this is doing, but it is doing something. So that's just added in, and then it passes through a tape plugin, which adds some really nice analog tape saturation. And then it's passing through Minimal Audio's Rift. And the cool thing with Minimal Audio is the positive cycle and the negative cycle can be assigned different distortion and saturations values and types. So that can lead to some very interesting results. And then finally, it just has a Pro EQ on here, and you see I've got a bit of shaping, boosting in the midsection to emphasize that in a very subtle cut. So I'll let you hear what it sounds like without and then with. And with. Cool. All right, so the next thing was this mid sound here. So what I've done with this mid that I ran through my pedals, I'll just let you hear what it sounds like without any effects on it. So that's it raw. Now, because it's run through pedals, it's mono. So I wanted to bring stereo information back into it. Also, I've straight away done a cut in the low section because I don't need any low end information because I've already got that in the original bass sound. So the first thing in the process, which is I added in some chorus. And then I added in a phaser. Then I squashed it. And then I added in this hybrid filter, and the hybrid filter is doing a low cut. And you can see I've got some automation on that. And if I bring up the automation lane, you'll see there's some moves here, which is just shaping these mids, these grimy mids that I've bounced out. And they're just, sweeping and moving over to create that texture. I didn't want the sound to overbear across the main bass. I just kind of wanted it to slide and merge in with it and create a texture that you could sense without it being too abrasive. Okay. Finally, we move over to this sound here, which was the sound that I just sort of bounced out to create this little bump. And I talked about adding reverb, so it's got the exact same process as the original bass, but then it moves into this morph EQ. And the morph EQ is just doing a sweep, accentuating different frequencies, and then that's passing through the solid state Logic's reverb called Flex Verb. And I've used a dark plate because as I said, I wanted it to sit back further in the mix. So when you want something to sound like it's further away, a really good way to do that, obviously the first thing is to think about gain or volume and bring it down. But using like a 6 decibel per octave filter can create the sense of it being far away. It's like that sound of something else in another room. And then with space as well, it can make it sound like it's being pushed back. So these are the effects that I put on there, and that just helps to push it back. Okay. On the so this 808 sweep that I've got, nothing crazy. I've actually just used the exact same effects process that I used on the main bass for consistency. The only difference that it has is with the Rift plugin. So I didn't want this to become too overbearing, but I just wanted to create some more presence. So what I've done is I've used the multi-band distortion here. So what this allows me to do is apply the distortion or saturation to this specific band while leaving the other parts untreated. So I've gone into the mids and just excited the mids a bit. And in terms of what's on there, I've just got the soft and the optical. And that just helped to give it a little bit of presence in the mids and the mix as well. Right, and then for the other sounds, I didn't need to do any treatment. The sounds already sounded good as they were. So this one here, perfectly fine, didn't need to do anything to it. And then this delayed mid sound as well, didn't need any treatment. Don't need to change anything, that's already good. Right, so we start structuring the track, or as I was working on, I was like, cool, I've got my main loop idea, and I wanted to start obviously expanding the track out. So you obviously work within a loop, you try different things until you get the idea that you want, and then you start to expand the loop. And that helps to build the track out. So we've got the main idea here. And you can see that that's in 4-bar sections. That creates one part. And then what I end up doing is building these into blocks. And these blocks end up becoming part of a 4-part section that creates up one body of the drop. Now, I've got these sounds, but then the next thing was like, okay, I need something to keep this interesting. So I don't need to add any more to the drums and the bass that I've already got, but I do need something to help carry the tune forward. And that's when we get into pads and effects. So the first thing I did was I grabbed a pad sound that fit within the context of the track. So this is the pad that I reached for. And it just had this really nice restrained sort of vibe to it that just sat as a very nice bed without detracting away from the core sound. And so I added this in. sounding really, really nice. So generally, once I start adding in a pad, the pad will usually dictate to me how I'm going to build my intro. So I was like, great, I've got a pad bed, but then I was like, this is happening on the third section, this part here, and I've still got a fourth section that I need to go to as well. And I'm like, what am I going to do? I don't really want to add a melody to this track. It's already got sort of tonal elements and this kind of moody, brooding sound, and I didn't want to make it melodic in any way. So I was like, well, how can I carry this forward? And I ended up just reaching, in this case, for another pad. And this was the other pad that I reached for. And it's got works, but it's a different tone, it's a different mood to it. And you'll hear that it's quite bright, it's quite hopeful sounding. So in contrast, when it goes from this original pad, which is like a little bed underneath, and then it shifts and it becomes really bright. Now, it sounds a bit weird when you're soloing them on their own, but in context of the track, it just helped carry everything. And it worked out perfectly because it helped to create this uplift and create a sort of climax to the sound that it was lifting up and resolving before it went into the breakdown before the second drop. So those are the pad sounds there. Now, I haven't done anything wild, okay? Just that first original pad sound just has some delay, which is just the cluster delay. And that just helps to give it some wash. It doesn't need to be exact and precise because it's a pad bed. It's just sort of floating through and just gives a bit of, gives me some tails when it comes off. And then the other one, just a bit of high cutting on it, just take out the low end information within it so that it's not conflicting. All right, and that just keeps everything tidy. Okay, and then we get into those little things that decorate your track nicely. You think about what we're working with here, it's drum and bass. So drum and bass is about drums and bass. So I don't want to confuse that. I really like those to be the core elements of my track. And so what we need is things that just help to carry and decorate and sprinkle all through the track that keep things interesting. So we've got a few different sounds here. The first one is I've got this stab. Then I've got this really cool dystopian Rhodes. I've got a reverse vocal sweep. And then I've got this little melodic part that comes off of the tail. And that's it. All those things are the little paint strokes that flicker at certain moments while the track's playing out to keep things carrying forward and interesting. So I went and I got these pads, I got these sounds, and I'm like, cool. So all I did was I start to build out the intro. I had the main body of the track, my 4 sections. So I kind of had the meat of the track laid out, and so I just needed to make an intro. So I decided to go with a more restrained kind of start to the intro. I didn't want it to come in with all the maximum energy that the drums have to offer. I wanted to create a sense of building. So if I just isolate the drums here and bring the track to the start, it's not as energetic as the main body. It has less hi-hats and it doesn't have all those ghost hits. So what I did was I took that, and then all it's doing is riding the pad and introducing some of the sound effects. And then what I've taken is these little bass cuts and sounds that I've built in, and I've just pop them through the introduction just to kind of create suggestions of what's coming without it getting fully into the main idea. So I'll just play it through and I'll show you the automation lane on my drums. So you'll see here I've got some mutes. So the first thing is the hi-hat is muted. And now they come in. So the hats are building. And then the next thing, which is the perks. Hi-hat 2 at the end. So those perks are now in. There's our dystopian jazz note. And then we've got the ghost snares. So that creates a real nice tail out of the intro, little introductions of certain bass sounds and these little complementary sounds that I have throughout the track, just introducing themselves without giving away the main idea. So that helps to build a bit of suspense. And then it came down to like, okay, cool. Now I need to create a drop. So what I've taken is this main mid sound, which anything with a delay and reverb is generally going to lead really nicely into a breakdown. And then we've got our reverse vocal, and then we've got this little melodic breakout. But the other thing which I've done is I've taken the drum break, and the drum break, I bounced out the audio, and pretty much what I've done here is just create this intro fill, and it's just drenched in reverb. And the reason I did that was to create that sense of space, it being further back before everything comes up front, because the drums are very present. They are very up front in the mix because they're one of the main features of the track. So to let you guys hear the breakdown of this as it sweeps in, what I decided to do creatively is I wanted to break it right down. I wanted to sweep it in real low and bring it back up before it got into the main energy of the track. So you get the idea there. For the second breakdown, I did something slightly different, which was keeping the same feel and context of the track, but when we can make just a slight difference to something, it just helps to keep everything more interesting. Whether the listener's aware of it or not, they will pick up that something just sort of seems to be continuous and evolving, but we're still kind of sticking within the root of what we've developed. So with that drum fill, I just added some chorus to this, and that's just creating a different bleed into the start. So on that breakdown, you get this effect. Lovely jubbly. Right, so after you've done the main body of the track, obviously you're going to take your groups, things like your drums, your bass, any kind of other sounds that fit into a context of group, but you want to put them in their own bus. And on this track, my busing is actually very simple because the processing was completely up to par in the beginning end, so I didn't need to do a whole lot on my buses. but I did want to show you a couple of little things in here. First thing is around the drum bus itself. So the drums, I've got the main break here running through to this auxiliary send, which is called the drum room. And the drum room is just exactly what it sounds like. So this is the drum room on its own. And that's just creating some space around the break to just give more depth, but without it being too overbearing. So if I solo these together and then take it out, you can hear the drums very quickly become quite dry. And with the routing of that, the drums from the drum room are routed into my drum bus here. So they come out through the auxiliary, and then all the kids on the drum room bus jump onto the main drum bus. Okay. And then when I go over to my drum bus, very, very simple. On that, we've got a standard clip again. So this is the culmination of all the parts. So not only the break that I built, but it's got the hi-hat loop, tambourine 1 and 2, the reverse splash, it's everything running together. So any little peaks are caught here. I generally don't like to do compression on my drum bus. So it's just a personal preference of mine. I prefer to use something like clipping. If I am using compression, it's usually as a send to create more texture or to dirty up the drums underneath, which I just slide underneath. And then that's running through Gullfoss. And Gullfoss is a very cool EQ. It makes very, very quick split-second EQ decisions based on the audio input. And I just use this as nothing drastic, but it does help with clarity and just the general stereo image of the drums. So that's just giving me some tonal balance control. Now, when I come over to the bass, bass again, very simple. So I've got two things on here. I've got Soothe 2 and then I've got Gullfoss for that as well. Now, what I use Soothe 2 for on my bass bus is this is where I do my side chaining. This is my personal workflow artistically. This is what I like. I like this better than doing side chaining with a compressor on a specific band. This thing is just a total lifesaver and a real game changer, really. So if we look here, I've got this preset, it's called Kick Sidechain, very much to the point, and it's just the feed of the kick channel from my drum break going into there. And so that's just doing reduction against the bass. So fairly fast attack and a really quick release. But it is quite aggressive. It's giving me about 12 dB of reduction. So there's no fight between this part of the frequency spectrum where the sub of the bottom end of the kick drum and the sub getting into conflict with one another and not building up. And it just sounds really clean. So one thing that bothers me as well with like side chaining with compressors for the same kind of outcome is I don't really like it when I can hear kind of like a pumping sound. For me, I don't like it. So this is how I do it. And then the same thing, I've got like the mid sound, which is just that delayed mid, and that's running through Gullfoss, and the pad bus is running through Gullfoss, and the sound effects are running through Gullfoss. So they're all just doing a last final little polish on the sound. And then finally, we get into the main part here. So the main thing is we've got Gullfoss again, but you'll notice that Gullfoss is Gullfoss Master, and what version of Gullfoss is specifically for the master bus or mastering. So it works a little bit different. I'm not going to break it all down, but you have some parameters here that exist universally across them all. So you've got recover, which is basically like boosting, taming, which is cutting, bias, which leans towards more of the recovery side or more to the tame side, brighten or darken, which changes the tilt, and then you've got boost, which can add more emphasis to the low end, or you could add more emphasis to the higher and mid-range. So those are the kind of parameters you get to adjust. Okay, so with the track running, this is laid in. Then I'm going through a Pro EQ, which is doing some tonal balancing. And with tonal balancing, I am using Isotope's tonal balance as a reference to guide me along. I've got a number of tracks that I have loaded in here that I like the way they sound, and depending on the style of the track I'm working on, I'll use those to guide me somewhat. We're then running into a multi-band compressor, which is just doing a small amount of compression and balancing with the track. And then we're running into the Ozone exciter, and I'm just doing some excitement in the mid-range and in the highs, but nothing in the bottom end. Then I've got the Ozone imager, and I'm just touching the mid-range width slightly. I haven't got anything passing over outside the scope, so I know my translation from stereo to mono is going to be good, but I just wanted a little bit more width or sense of width in the mid-range. But I don't use that stereoize function, because not in this instance, because that can do things that I don't like in my final mix. And then finally it comes down through to SSL's bus compressor, and the bus compressor has the sidechain or high pass filter, so it's high passed at 131.5 hertz, so that allows all my sub to go through without hitting or triggering the compressor, and it's only everything above that and the mid-range upwards that is triggering the compressor, and that helps to fill up the track and add energy and bring presence back to the track. And this SSL bus compressor is sick, and this plugin's made by SSL, so it's good. You should definitely give it a go. And then we've got standard clip, which is just grabbing any kind of transients and stuff poking through just to trim them off before it runs into the God particle. And the God particle I use on all of my tracks. It's always the first thing sitting on my master channel, because it's got a really nice built-in limiter to it. It safeguards me when I'm doing things like sound design to protect my monitors. It gives me a sense of what my track is going to sound like loud when it starts to get processed in a more of a mastering type format, which guides my mixing as I'm creating. And then we're running through the FabFilter Pro L, and I've stacked two of those. And the reason I've got two of those is because each one is only doing a little bit of limiting, and I'm using different styles of limiter to get the tone that I want. So I'm not letting one limiter do heaps of heavy lifting. I'm letting several do the combined effort. So what we'll do is we'll let the track run, and I'll bring it down from back here just before it drops, and I'm just going to start bringing in these other effects so that you guys can hear what the result is. Pretty sick. I'm sure you guys noticed that SSL compressor kick in once I threw that on, and you hear the loudness and stuff come through with the compressors and the limiter. So that is the run through of my track layers, to give you guys some insight to a way, not the way, a way to mix and build a track. Thanks very much for coming along today. If you've been into what I've showed you and it is valuable to you, please like and subscribe. Share with anyone that you think will be into this. Also, please go to my website, dnbartist.com, and sign up for my email list so that you find out when I drop the Vital preset pack, and of course when one-to-one tuition comes available, and any other thing that I think might be valuable to you if you're into what I'm doing here. So thanks for coming along today. It's been great to see you guys. Catch you next time.